Some men can talk for an hour and say nothing. And some men say one sentence and it goes into you like a splinter you never want to take out. I've been keeping a weather book for 22 years. Rain, wind, frost, the day the well went bad. Every night one line. That's all a man needs most days. But in April of 1886, a woman stepped down off a freight wagon in front of my loading chute, and she was crying so hard she couldn't get her second boot to the ground. And 9 days later, an old mountain man came down out of the Chiricahuas smelling like bear grease and juniper smoke, and he leaned in and said one sentence to her. I watched her face change like weather. And I never heard it. That's the part that's kept me up 30 years. Not the posse, not the boy in my hay barn, not what I did with the letter I never mailed. It's that I was standing 40 feet away with a pencil stub in my pocket, in the business of writing things down, and God saw fit to send the wind through the cottonwoods right at that exact moment. So stay with me, because I did find out what he said. It took me until the end of everything to find out, and when I did, I never wrote it in the book. You'll understand why. She got the first boot down fine. It was the second one that broke her. She sat there on the freight wagon stepboard with one foot in the dust of my yard and the other still up on the board, and she folded forward over her own knees and made a sound I have only heard twice in my life, the other time being from a horse with a leg gone wrong. Ferris Doyle, who drove the freight in from Bowie twice a month and had the emotional range of a fence post, looked at me over the top of her bent back with an expression that said she's yours now clear as if he'd shouted it. I fidgeted with the pencil stub in my vest pocket. I do that. 44 years old and I roll a pencil between my fingers when I don't know what to do with my hands, which is most of the time, which is why the pencil's worn down to about the length of a chicken bone. "Ma'am," I said. She didn't hear me. The dust was still hanging. It hangs a long time in that yard because I never did get around to laying gravel, and the light came through it sideways off the tin of the loading chute and turned everything the color of weak tea. The mules stamped. Somebody's chicken was making a fuss behind the mercantile. And this woman, small, dark hair coming loose under a hat that had been fashionable in a place a very long way from here, sat on the step of a freight wagon and cried like the world had ended 9 days ago, and she'd only just now caught up to it. Which, as it turns out, was exactly the case. I should say here that I knew who she was before she ever said her name. That is the whole trouble. Her name was Naomi Bright. I knew it the way you know a bad tooth is coming, a dull certainty a long ways off. I'd had it in my head since the 16th of March, and here it was the 12th of April, and in the top drawer of my desk, under a tobacco tin and a broken pair of spectacles, was a letter I had written to Miss Naomi Bright of Delaware County, Ohio, on the 16th of March. I never mailed it. I want to tell you there was a reason, that the freight didn't come, that I lost it, that there was weather. There was no weather. I wrote it down in the book that night. Mar 16, clear, wind SW light, first mesquite budding. I always write the weather. I did not write today. I did not mail the letter that would have kept a woman in Ohio from spending her last $40 on a train ticket to a man who is under 3 feet of caliche behind my corral. You don't write that kind of thing. That's the whole reason the book exists, to be a place where nothing like that ever has to go. Ferris got her trunk down. It was a small trunk. That surprised me. Women who came out to marry usually brought more than they could carry, as if hauling a thing across a continent made it a promise. "She been like this since Bowie?" I asked him low. "Since Wilcox," he spat. "Been askin' after Elias Hale the whole way, ever station, ever water stop. I never said nothin' 'cause I don't know nothin'." He looked at me and his eyes had a little hardness in them that I earned. "But you do, Wade." Ferris Doyle, emotional range of a fence post. Fence posts, it turns out, are load-bearing. He climbed back up and clucked the mules, and left me standing in my own yard with a stranger's grief and a pencil in my pocket. Here is what I knew about Elias Hale. He dug wells. He was not a good-looking man. He had a jaw like a shovel blade and hands that never came clean, and he had a way of squatting on his heels beside a hole he dug and looking down into it with his hat pushed back, listening, the way another man might listen at a door. He said you could hear water. He said it wasn't a sound exactly. It was a coolness in the sound of everything else. He worked my place 3 summers. He built the stone lip on my well that's still there. He was 39 and he'd never married, and about 2 years back he answered an advertisement. And after that, Elias Hale, who had said maybe 400 words to me in 3 summers, started coming around on Sundays wanting to know how to spell things. Wade, how do you spell sincerely? How do you spell orchard? Wade, and this one he asked with his hat off, which he never did. How do you spell beloved? I told him. I did not laugh. I want that on the record because there is a great deal I did wrong in this, and I need the one thing I did right to stand up somewhere. I told him, and he wrote it slow on the back of a flour sack with a carpenter's pencil, pressing so hard he tore it, and he had to start over. He died on the 8th of March. Not a pash. Not anything with a story in it. A wall of a well came in on him at 9 feet, which is nothing, which is a depth a man can stand up in, and by the time we got him out he was gone and his hands were still full of the dirt he'd been trying to push away from his own face. He had a letter in his coat. He carried them all. There were 14 of them, and they were tied with a boot lace, and they smelled like him. I buried him behind the corral because the ground there is soft, and because I could see it from the porch, and I have never once decided whether that was kindness or punishment. Where is he? I turned around. She was standing. She'd got the second boot down after all. Up close she was maybe 32, and she had a face that had been holding still for a very long time, the way a face gets when a woman has spent years being pleasant to people who never asked her anything. There was a smear of dust from her thumb across her cheekbone where she'd tried to fix herself before she stood up. Her eyes were swollen almost shut. She'd known. That's what I understood in that second. She'd known since Wilcox, or before Wilcox, or maybe since the letters stopped and no explanation came. She had ridden 2,000 miles on a certainty, and she had spent every one of those miles begging the certainty to be wrong. Ma'am, I'm not asking you to say it. Her voice was ruined, but it was steady, which is a combination I had not encountered before. I've heard 4 men not say it between here and Wilcox. I'm asking you where he is. The wind came up. It does that around 4. I took my hat off. That was answer enough, and she took it like a fist, 1 step back, 1 hand out to nothing. But she didn't fall. I've thought on that a great deal. She rocked and she found her feet again, and she stood there in my yard with the dusk going by, and she said, "Show me." And then, after a moment, "Please." And the please was worse than anything. So I showed her. She stood at the grave a long time and didn't cry at all. That's the thing nobody tells you about grief. It goes where it wants. It comes up out of a person over a boot that won't reach the ground, and then a woman looks at the actual dirt over the actual man, and her face is as empty as a plate. There was no marker. I had meant to. I'd cut the board even. It was in the barn. 9 days, she said. Ma'am, he's been dead 35 days. She said it like a woman reading a bill. And I've known 9 of them. So for 26 days I sat on a train and I thought about the orchard. Something turned over in me. He wrote to me about an orchard. She crouched down, not the way a lady crouches, the way a person does who's spent her life kneeling to scrub things, and she put her palm flat on the caliche. Peaches and 2 apple, and he said the ground was wrong for it and he was going to make the ground right. He said it'd take 4 years. He said he'd already started. I stood there with my hat in my hands. I thought about that for 26 days, Mr. Coleman, she said. A man making ground right for 4 years for somebody he'd never met. The stone lip of my well was 30 feet behind us, and I could not look at it. I put her in the back room that had been my mother's. She didn't eat. I heard her moving around at 2 in the morning, and then at 3 there was nothing. And at 4 I heard her crying, and I lay in my bed with my eyes open, and did the arithmetic that a coward does at 4 in the morning. That if I told her about the letter now, it would be for me and not for her. That a confession is just a man handing his own weight to somebody who's already carrying too much. That there would be a better time. There is never a better time. There's just later and then never, and they look identical from the inside. That night in the book I wrote, April 12, clear, wind SW, hot for the season. That's all, that's the whole entry. 12 years I've had that book, and that's the one page I can find with my eyes shut. She stayed. Nobody expected it. There was money enough, we found, in a tin under the floorboard of the little house Elias had been building on the flat, $41, and a receipt for 2 apple whips and 4 peach, ordered from a nursery in Missouri, paid for in November, to be shipped in the spring. They came on the 21st. Ferris hauled them in a burlap bundle, and they looked like the deadest sticks God ever made. And Naomi Bright came out of my house, where she had been not eating for 9 days, and she took that bundle out of his hands, and she sat down in the yard with it in her lap. And here is the thing I could not have predicted. She got up the next morning at 4:30, and she went out to the flat with Elias Hale's shovel, and she started digging. Now understand, the ground on that flat is caliche a foot down. It is not soil, it is a mistake that God left in. You hit it and the shovel rings, and your teeth ring and your elbows ring, and a strong man will get 1 hole a day out of it and be sick that night. She was 5'2". I rode out there the second day to tell her to stop, and I sat my horse at the edge of the flat for maybe an hour without saying anything, and then I rode home. I want to describe it right. She wasn't heroic. That's a word for people who watch. She was bad at it. She had the shovel wrong, choked up high like a broom, and she was doing all of it with her back and none with her legs, and she stopped every 11 or 12 strokes and stood with her hands on the handle and her forehead on her hands, breathing. Her palms went first. She wrapped them in strips off her petticoat and kept on. By the 4th day the strips were brown and stiff, and she had to soak them off in the evening in a basin, and she did that alone with the door shut, and I heard her not making a sound. I brought her a mattock on the 5th day. I don't want help, she said. It isn't help, it's a tool. I set it against the stump. A shovel's for dirt, there's no dirt here. Everybody out here learns that eventually. Elias learned it. That was the first time she looked at me, really looked. The way you look at a man when you've decided he might be furniture or might be a person. Did he? She said. He broke 2 shovels his first year. I turned the pencil in my pocket. He said the ground here doesn't fight you. He said it just doesn't care, and a man who takes it personal will lose. She picked up the mattock. He was wrong, she said. It's personal. She got 1 tree in the ground on the 6th day. It took her 6 days to dig 1 hole. She sat down in the dirt beside it, and she laughed, one dry, cracked bark of a laugh, and then she pressed her wrapped hands over her mouth and her shoulders started going, and I stood back by the horses and let her have it, because there's a mercy in not being looked at. Then she said, without turning around, Mr. Coleman, did he suffer? I have been asked that question maybe 11 times in my life, and I have lied maybe 11 times. I looked at that raw hole in the ground. I looked at her wrapped hands. Yes, I said. The silence after that was long enough that I heard a hawk 2 miles off. Thank you, she said. And I understood, standing there, that I had just done the first honest thing in 5 weeks, and that it had cost me nothing, and that the reason I had done it was that it wasn't my lie to keep. Mine was still in the drawer, under the tobacco tin. Ezra Coltrane came down out of the mountains on the 28th. He came down twice a year, once in the fall with hides and once in the spring with I never knew what, and he had been coming down since before the war and nobody knew how old he was. 60. 80. He had a beard like a badly made nest, and one eye gone milky, and he smelled. I mean this without unkindness, like bear grease and juniper smoke, and something underneath that was just the smell of a man who has not been indoors in 30 years. He wintered up in the Chiricahuas. He had Chiricahua kin, or had had. Nobody in Sabino Bend asked, and in 1886, nobody in Sabino Bend wanted to know, because Geronimo was out and the whole territory was holding its breath, and there were soldiers at every water hole from here to the border with orders that changed weekly and tempers that didn't change at all. Ezra Coltrane did not care about any of that. He came down for coffee and salt and to look at people, the way you'd go look at the ocean. And he had buried men with me. He'd helped pull Elias out of that well. He'd been there. He rode into my yard on a mule with his knees up around his ears, and he got down and he stood there a while. And then he said, "Wade." "Ezra." "That her." She was out at the flat. You could just see her from the yard, a dark upright mark on all that pale ground, and the mark went down and came up and went down. "That's her," I said. He watched a long while. The wind moved his beard. "How many she got in?" "2. 6 common. 6. He nodded slowly. Then he said something I've turned over 10,000 times since. He said, "Elias told me he was mackin' that orchard so she'd have something of him that kept growin' after." I said, "After what?" And Ezra Coltrane turned his one good eye on me and did not answer, and I felt the bottom go out of the day. He walked out there. I followed at a distance because I am not a good man, but I am a curious one, and I stopped at the edge of the flat by the stump where the mattock had been. She saw him coming and straightened up. I want you to picture this. A woman with her hands in rags and her hair stuck to her neck and dirt to her elbows, standing in a rectangle of ground she has been killing herself in for a week, and a filthy ancient mountain man walking toward her with his hat in his hand, which is a thing I had never in my life seen him do. He said something. I couldn't hear it, he was quiet-spoken always, and there was 50 feet and the wind coming up the way it does at 4. She said something back, short. Then he leaned in a little, the way you do when what you have to say is small and needs the extra few inches, and he said one sentence. I know it was one sentence. I could see the shape of it. One breath, one string of words, and then his mouth closed. And the cottonwoods went off along the wash like a rush of water, and I did not hear one syllable of it. What I saw was her face. Everything I have described to you up to this point, the flatness, the plate-empty look, the woman holding still, went off her face like a sheet coming off furniture. She put her hand out and took hold of his sleeve, not falling, holding on. And she cried, but not the way she cried on the wagon step. That crying had been a thing being torn out of her. This was something else, and I have only got one word for it, and it's the wrong word, and I'm going to use it anyway. This was relief. Ezra Coltrane stood there and let a strange woman hold his sleeve, and he looked off at the mountains he'd come down from with an expression like a man in church who doesn't believe in it but respects the room. Then he put his hat back on and walked past me and never said a word, and got on his mule and rode out toward the wash. I stood in my own yard for a good while. Then I did what I have always done, which is I went inside and I got the book down, and I opened it to the 28th of April, and I put the pencil in my mouth to wet it, and I sat there. April 28, clear wind SW rising PM. I sat there some more. I have written down what men said. I've got Elias in that book. E. Hale says water has a coolness to it in the sound of other things. I've got my father's last words in there, which weren't much. I've got the day the baker's boy drowned and what his mother said in the road. It is a small vanity, that book. I know it. A man who writes down what the wind did is a man who wants some proof he was standing there. And the one time it mattered. The one time in 22 years that somebody said the true thing. The thing that reached in and took a woman's grief and turned it a quarter turn so she could carry it. I was 40 feet off, and the trees went, and I had nothing. I wrote nothing. I put the pencil down. Then I opened the drawer to get the tobacco tin, and there was my letter to Miss Naomi Bright, Delaware County, Ohio, 5 weeks and 5 days old, and I looked at it for a while, and I did not burn it. I want to be exact about why. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't honesty. It was this. It was the only object in the world that proved I had tried, for one afternoon in March, to be the man who told her. I kept it for me. That is the whole of my character in one sentence, and I've had 30 years to find a better one, and I have not. She came in at full dark. She'd got a third hole started. She sat down at my table and she ate, the first real eating in 17 days, cornbread and beans, and she ate like a hand, and I watched her and didn't ask. Then she said, "You want to know what he told me?" The lamp guttered. I turned the pencil in my pocket. "That's your business," I said. "It is." She looked at her hands, at the wrappings, at the black under the nails that would never entirely come out again for the rest of her life. "I'll say it to you sometime. Not tonight. Tonight it's still mine." And she almost smiled, the corner of her mouth going up while her eyes stayed wet, a thing I hadn't known a face could do. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "where would a man get 4 years of water for an orchard in a place like this?" "He'd dig," I said. "That's what I thought," she said, and went to bed. I went out at midnight to shut the barn. I'd been remiss. The wind was up and the door was banging. I want to tell this part plain, because it's where everything after comes from. There was a smell in the barn that wasn't horse. I stood in the doorway with the lantern down at my knee, and my heart went up into my throat and stayed there, and I looked at the hay in the far corner, and the hay looked back. He was maybe 11, maybe 12. I've never been able to guess a boy's age, and I've had 30 years and I still see him at both. He was Chiricahua. He had a rag knotted around his thigh that had gone black and stiff, and his eyes were enormous and perfectly still, and one hand was under the hay, and I did not need to be told what was in it. Outside, faint, from the direction of the road, came a sound I knew. The sound of shod horses moving at night in numbers, which is not a sound that means anything good in April of 1886. Ezra Coltrane had ridden out toward the wash and not come back. And in the house behind me, a woman who had come 2,000 miles to marry a dead man was asleep in my mother's room, dreaming, I suppose, of trees. I set the lantern down. I don't know yet what I. That's what I remember about the first 10 seconds, that I never lifted it. Some part of me had already decided that if I raised the light I would have to see him properly, and once I saw him properly I would be a man who had seen him, and there is no undoing that. Outside, the horses on the road went from a sound to a number. 8, maybe 9. Men riding at night keep their voices down and their gear quiet, and the quieter they are the more of them there generally are. The boy in the hay did not move, not a finger. He had the stillness of something that has learned that stillness is the last thing it owns. I said low, "There's water in the trough." He didn't understand a word of it. I knew that. I said it anyway because my mouth wanted to be doing something other than shaking, and because, I have thought about this, I wanted him to hear the shape of a voice that wasn't hunting him. Then I stepped back out and pulled the barn door to, and I put my shoulder against it in the dark, and I stood there listening to 8 men ride past the mouth of my lane and not turn in. Not turn in. I want to be honest about the sound I made when they went on by. It was not a brave sound. I went in for the lantern oil at midnight, and Naomi Bright was standing in my kitchen in a shawl with her ruined hands wrapped fresh, looking at me. "Who's in the barn?" she said. Not what's wrong. Not is someone out there. She had been awake, I suppose, the way she was awake most nights, and she'd heard me go, and she'd heard me not come back, and she had done the arithmetic faster than I could have. I had a lie ready. It was a good one. It arrived whole, the way they do for me. I have a talent for it, it turns out. I only found out that spring how much of a talent, and I opened my mouth to say nothing. A coyote got in, and instead I heard myself say, "A boy." Her eyes moved once, to the window to the road. "Whose boy?" "Ma'am," I said, "he's Chiricahua." The clock ticked. The lamp burned. Somewhere out past the corral, the ground had Elia's hail in it and had had him for 40 days. I watched her face, and I waited to see the thing I had seen on the faces of every white man and woman between here and the Mississippi that year. It's a small movement. It happens under the skin. It is the face closing like a hand. She said, "How bad is he hurt?" She took the basin. She took the whiskey and the good sheet off my mother's bed, and she went out across that dark yard barefoot with her chin up like she was going to a christening. And I came after her saying words that meant stop and think and hang me, and she paid them exactly the attention they deserved. At the barn door she stopped. "Bring the light in slow," she said, "and stand where he can see the door behind you. He needs to know he can leave." I have never in my life felt as stupid as I felt at that moment, holding my own lantern in my own barn, being taught how to enter a room. His leg had a bullet through the meat of the thigh, above the knee, and it had gone through clean 4 or 5 days ago and had gone bad since. The rag was doing more harm than the hole. When she took it off, he made no sound at all, and his hand was still under the hay, and it stayed there the whole time, and I stood in the doorway sweating. She talked while she worked. Not to him, she knew he had no English. She talked the way you talk to a horse, low and level, and what she said was inventory. "That's whiskey, it's going to hurt, I'm sorry. That's clean. That's my hand. That's my hand again." On and on. Her voice never once went up at the end of a sentence. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and let out a long breath, and she said to me, in exactly the same voice, "There are 8 men on the road. 9. They'll come back at first light and ask to look in the barn. They will. And you'll say yes." She was wringing the rag out into the basin. The water went brown, because a man who says no is a man with something in his barn. I turned the pencil over in my pocket. I could feel the flat facet where my thumbnail rides. "Mrs. Hale," I said, and I did not hear myself do it. I only heard it afterward ringing, and neither of us corrected it, then or ever. "There is nowhere on this place to put him. There's the barn, the house, the smokehouse, and the corral. They'll walk all 4 in 11 minutes. She sat there with the brown water dripping off her fingers. And then her whole face changed, and I got a bad, cold, marvelous feeling, because I had seen that face change once before, out on the flat, when an old man leaned in and said something to her that I could not hear. "There's the hole," she said. You have to understand what she was proposing. 6 days with a mattock. Palms gone, then healed wrong, then gone again. A hole in caliche 4 feet across and near enough 4 deep, cut for the root ball of a peach tree that had come 2,000 miles in a burlap sack, that a dead man had paid for in November with money he did not have. And a third one, started, waist deep, out on the far edge of the flat where the brush comes down off the wash. She was proposing we put a living boy in it. "He'll suffocate," I said. "Not if we lay the sticks right." She stood up. Her knees cracked. "Mr. Coleman, I have spent 9 days learning exactly how deep that ground will let me go. Nobody in the territory knows that ground better than me right now, including you." Which was true. Which is the plainest fact in this whole account, and it took me until I was an old man to see what it meant. That grief had made her an expert in something, the way it does, and that she was about to spend her expertise on a stranger. We got him out there at 2. He couldn't walk. I carried him, and he weighed less than a saddle, and he never once took that hand out from under his shirt, and I never once asked to see what was in it, and we both understood the arrangement. We laid ocotillo ribs across the mouth of the hole and brush over that, and a scatter of the pale caliche chalk over the brush, so it read the same as the rest of the flat. And before we shut him in, Naomi knelt down at the edge and held up one finger and pointed at the sun that wasn't up yet, and moved her finger across the sky and stopped it at the far side and pointed at the ground and shook her head. Not till it goes down. Not till. He looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. I have thought about that nod for 30 years. He was 11. He had been shot and he had been running, and he had come down out of the mountains to a barn belonging to a white man he did not know, and he lay down in a hole dug for a peach tree by a woman he had never seen, and he nodded at her, and he trusted her, and she had done nothing to earn it except be kneeling. We put the sticks over him. It took 9 seconds. It is the single worst thing I have ever done with my hands, and I would do it again tomorrow. They came at 6:10, 11 men, not 9. Hobart Skelt ran them. He ran cattle on the rucker, and he had a boy in the 4th Cavalry, and he was not a cruel man, which I want on the record, because the story would be easier if he was. He was a tired, frightened rancher with a rifle across his pommel and 200 miles of rumor in his ears. There was a sergeant with them, a red-necked Ohio man, who kept apart and looked at nothing and clearly wished to be dead. Wade. Hobart. We tracked one down the wash. He didn't get off his horse. Blood on the rocks, little one from the print, wounded. Little one, I said. They're the ones that get away and grow up. He said it flat, like a man reciting a price. You seen anything? And here is what I have to tell you. The lie went out of me like water out of a broken jug. Easy. Warm almost. My face did nothing. My hands did nothing. I stood in my own yard and told 11 armed men that I had been up at midnight after a coyote in the barn and had seen nothing but my own chickens. And while I said it, I was thinking, with a clarity that has never left me, this is the same machinery. This is the exact same machinery that kept a letter in a drawer for 5 weeks. I am good at this. That is the thing. It is not that lying is hard for me and I rose to it. It's that I have always had a gift for the sentence that does not have to be true, and for 39 days I had used it on a woman, and now I used it on Hobart Skelt, and the same muscle moved. You want to hear that a man's cowardice can be turned to good use? It's more disgusting than that. It's the same tool. You just point it somewhere else. They looked in the barn. 11 minutes near enough. Skelt came out and stood squinting west at the flat, and my heart went into my mouth and sat there like a stone, because from the yard you can see the whole of that flat, and on it, plain as print, were 2 young peach trees standing in fresh-turned rings, and a mattock leaning on a stump, and a rectangle of scarred ground where a woman had been fighting caliche for 9 days. And out at the edge, brush. What in hell, said Hobart Skelt, is that? Naomi Bright came out of my house with a coffee pot. She had put on the good dress. Her hands were wrapped and she'd pulled her cuffs down over the wrappings, and she went straight to Skelt's stirrup and looked up at him and said, "It's an orchard, sir." Nobody said anything. 6 trees, she said. 2 apple, 4 peach. My husband ordered them from Missouri in November, and they came on the 21st, and he is behind that corral, and I have got 2 of them in the ground, and I would be obliged if your men did not ride across it. The silence out there went on so long I heard a hawk. Then the Ohio sergeant, who had not looked at anything all morning, took his hat off. And Hobart Skelt sat there on his horse and looked at 2 dead-looking sticks in the ground, and a woman with her cuffs pulled down over her hands, and something in the man came apart, and he said, "Ma'am, I knew Elias Hale. He dug my well. And after a while, I'm sorry for your loss." They rode out around the flat. Every man of them. 11 men going 100 yards out of their way over broken ground to spare an orchard, single file, past a hole with a boy in it, and Hobart Skelt lifting his hat as he went by, and the wind coming up off the wash the way it does even in the morning. Ezra Coltrane's mule came in at noon with the coffee, and the salt still tied on. Nothing else. No blood on the saddle, no tracks worth following, no word then or later. 2 years afterward, a man in Bowie told me he'd heard Coltrane was living up at Kenyatta Alamosa with kin and had gone blind in the other eye, and I did not believe him, and I paid for his supper anyway. I have never known whether Ezra rode toward that wash on the 20th of April because he'd left something there, or because he meant to lead 11 men away from it, or because he was an old man on a mule who went where he went. I know he came down that day and put his hat in his hand for a woman. I know a wounded boy turned up in my barn 11 hours later, and Ezra Coltrane was the only living soul who could have brought him down off that mountain, and the only living soul who would have known that Wade Coleman buries people and doesn't ask. He never told me. He never told me anything. He walked past me in my own yard with his mouth shut and got on his mule. That's the sacrifice, if you want to call it that. Nobody saw it. Nobody wrote it in a book. A man traded whatever he had left for a boy nobody would ever have missed, and then the wind took the sound of it, the same as it took the other thing. April 28, clear wind SW rising PM, that's what I have. That's the whole page. We got the boy out at dusk. He was alive. He had eaten the caliche chalk off his own lips, and he could not stand, and his eyes were enormous. And Naomi Bright sat down in the dirt at the edge of the hole and put her forehead on her wrapped hands and shook for about a minute and a half, and then stopped and got up. She fed him. She fed him for 2 days in the smokehouse, and on the third night she cut down Elias Hale's coat, the good one, the one he'd have married in, and sewed the sleeves up short and put it on that boy. And when she was buttoning it, she was steady, and when she got to the last button, she wasn't. He left before light on the 1st of May. He took the coat and a sack of cornbread, and he did not take the mattock, though I set it where he'd see it, and he did not take the shotgun, though I did not set that anywhere. At the edge of the yard, he stopped and turned around and stood there a while, and then he made a small motion with his hand that I did not understand at all, and Naomi did. Or she didn't, but she raised her hand back. He went up the wash, and that is the end of what I know about him. She never planted the third tree in the third hole. She dug a new one, 20 feet off. It took her another 5 days, and by then her hands were past hurting and had gone to something worse, which is numb, and she never complained once, and I have never forgotten the sound of that mattock coming down at 4:30 in the morning while I lay in bed and did not go help her. The old hole she filled in herself. She wouldn't let me touch it. Now the sentence. She told me on the 12th of April, 1889, 3 years to the day off that freight wagon, and I know because it's in the book, April 12, overcast, wind NE. Cool, sitting on the step of the little house on the flat that she had finished with her own money and Elias' tin, with 4 peach and 2 apples standing up around her, none of them taller than she was, all of them alive. I had brought the marker out. I had finally cut the name into it, 3 years. She looked at it a long while. Then she said, "You want to know what Mr. Coltrane said to me?" I said I did. I said it too fast. I had been waiting 1,096 days. And Naomi Hale, who had been Naomi Bright for 32 years, and a widow of a man she never met for 3, said. He said, he had your letters out in his hand when the wall came in, and he was holding them up out of the dirt, and that's why he couldn't dig. The wind went through the peach trees. I sat on that step and I did not move my face, because by then I was very, very good at not moving my face. I pulled Elias Hale out of that hole with my own 2 hands. I know exactly how he was lying. I know his coat was buttoned to the throat and the letters were inside it, dry, tied with a boot lace, and I know what his hands were full of because I had to open them and it was not paper. Ezra Coltrane had lain in the sun of my flat and looked at a woman who had come 2,000 miles to find out whether she had been real to a man, whether she was a widow or only a fool who'd answered an advertisement. And he had given her the one thing on this earth that would answer that question, and he had made it up out of nothing at all. And it healed her. I watched it heal her. 9 days she couldn't eat, and on the 10th she went out with a shovel and started making ground right. For 4 years, the way he had, because a man dying 9 feet down had chosen her over the dirt. I could have told her. I had the standing, I was there. I turned the pencil in my pocket. "That's a fine thing," I said. That night I wrote, April 12, 1889, overcast, wind NE, cool. Set marker at EH6, trees leafed out, no loss. I have never written the sentence. It has been in me 30 years, and it is the only true thing I own, and it will not go in the book, because the book is for what was so, and that was not so, and it was truer than anything else that ever happened on this place. I did put something in the ground, though. That spring, before she filled that old hole in, I went out in the dark with a folded letter that had been in a drawer under a tobacco tin since the 16th of March, 1886, and I laid it in the bottom, and I did not read it again first. She filled the hole herself the next morning. She wouldn't let me touch it. She never asked me what I had put down there. Sometimes I think she never had to ask. Sometimes I think about the way Ezra Coltrane looked off at his mountains while a strange woman held his sleeve like a man in a church he doesn't believe in but respects the room, and I wonder whether she knew what he was doing while he did it, whether she took it anyway, whether that's what she meant at my table when she said tonight it's still mine. Whether a woman can accept a mercy she can see the seams in and let it hold her up for 30 years and never once put her thumb to the stitching. I don't know. I have a book with 22 years of weather in it, and there is nothing in it about any of this. And out on that flat, the peaches came in so heavy in '94 that a limb broke, and she cried about the limb, and I stood back by the horses and let her, and